Japan Cultural Exploration in Guam.
Okay, good day, half a day, and thank you very much for joining us. You know, when you grow up in Guam, there are many family names that we took as local names, even though they were clearly Japanese in origin. So Yamashita, Tanaka, Shinohara, Okada, Sudo, Ishizaki, Onodera, and Yamanaka, and many of these names were quite common, and we just knew many individuals like our guest here in growing up, and these individuals eventually became prominent in business and political circles and education. So senators named Tanaka and Sudo and Okiyama and Ishizaki are kind of part of the political roll call on Guam. Educators named Yamashita, Chamorro cultural experts named Onodera, business leaders like Shinohara and Shimizu are all part of our lives in Guam society today. So those original immigrants came to Guam in the early part of the 20th century. They married Chamorro women and adopted local names. Sanshiro became Gregorio, Oneni became Camilo. They contributed to the life of the island in many ways as merchants and traders, and they brought soy sauce and rice and rakyo and daigo, and as well as Japanese candy. And I'm wondering what our lives would be like today without daigo or finadeni without kikuman. And that's the kind of like, it's just blended into the way we are. So this morning we have two individuals with us who will be representing these family lines, the more prominent ones, Gil Shinohara and Frankie Shizaki, and they're going to tell us about their grandfather and how they came to Guam, and then also their experiences with the Ishizaki family name and the Shinohara family name, and how that intertwined maybe with World War II, and then subsequently, and how they fit into that. And that time makes their stories more powerful because there's a lot of joy there. There's also a lot of sorrow. There's also a lot of challenges. But they're going to inform us, I think, that the impact of Japan through these men was much more powerful and predated anything that happened in World War II or even tourism from Japan. So I'm very grateful for having two individuals with us. So we'll just start with Frank. Maybe Frank, you can just tell us a little bit about yourself and what you know about the Ishizaki family name as it came to Guam.
Wow, that's a long. How much time do we have? So my name is Frankie Shizaki. I was born in Japan, actually right after World War II. So I was born in Utsunomiya, Tochigi-ken. And then when I was 3 years old, my mother and I moved here. My father had come home sooner, and then I grew up here. So I was 3 years old when I first got here, and I grew up in a Chamorro village in Santa Rita. And all of the kids I played were either my cousins or my neighbor friends. And language-wise, I spoke baby Japanese, Nihongo, and then I had to learn Chamorro, and then we had to go to first grade, and we all had to learn English. So it was a kind of a confusing time for me. So that's how my life started. And beyond that, I went to public school here. I became a chemist. I was first chemistry graduate from the University of Guam. And I thought I was going to make beer for San Miguel. And the police department kept harassing me. So I finally surrendered and I became a police officer. And I did that because the director promised to send me to graduate school. And that was the one thing I wanted. And so after I did the police academy training, I went up to grad school to the University of Pittsburgh. And then I came back and I started building the crime laboratory for the Guam Police Department.
And so, now tell us a little bit about the first Ishizaki that came, your grandfather. What you were told about him, or the family story about him.
Well, my grandfather, I never met him because he died during the invasion of Guam. And he was one of the Japanese men that was trying to go up to Jigo. And he was with my Uncle Ben. And my Uncle Ben, spent a lot of time talking to my Uncle Ben, trying to figure out where it was. It was somewhere north of here, but not quite up to Jigo. And anyway, so he perished during the American invasion. He came to Guam in the early 1900s as part of the Shimizu Corporation, and he wasn't called that, but they recruited about 100 Japanese men, and he was one of those people. And so he worked for the corporation, and then met my grandmother, Philomena Tovis Perez, and they ventured off and they moved to Sumai, and my grandfather started a bunch of businesses. So he did very well. The family was well off, economically set. So the war was terrible. It was bad for the Ishizaki family. And so that was kind of our start.
Yeah, I see. All right. And Gil, tell us a little bit about yourself and the original Mr. Shinohara.
Well, I'm Gil Shinohara, and currently I'm a businessman. I'm a retired government of Guam employee, and
You're not just a retired government of Guam employee. You held many, many important positions in the government.
well, I held a few.
Yeah.
My last stint in the government was as the governor's chief of staff under former Governor Carl Gutierrez. So there's a lot of history with my family. My grandfather migrated to Guam in 1905. He started his family in 1920, marrying my grandmother, who was Carmen Castro Torres. And they had 2 children, my dad, who was Gil Torres Shinohara, and his sister, Cecilia Shinohara, who married Fred Savory from the Bonin Islands. And after his passing, she married Manuel Calvo, who was a former mayor here in Guam. So our family has a lot of history. My grandfather coming in to Guam was on a boat on his way to the United States, and supposedly to get an American education, but when his boat hit Guam, he decided to stay here. His brother went on to the United States, and I believe settled in Colorado. But my grandfather started businesses here. Through my readings and stuff, I found that he was the founder of the Japanese Society of Guam. He was the founder of the Japanese Chamber of Commerce here in Guam. So he was very prominent pre-war in the business community with the Japanese on Guam. And subsequent to the war happening, he had a very challenged life. He went through prison because of charges that were brought against him by the United States government. He was actually sentenced to death by hanging, and it was something that was overcome because of appeals that went through all the way up to the Secretary of the Navy, and his sentence was commuted, and his total jail sentence, if I'm not mistaken, ended up being 8 years, and that was in 1945. And my grandfather was allowed to step back on Guam in June of 1961. And he passed away here in 1969.
So that was a long story of his, time in Japan, because when he was sentenced, then he was actually sent back to Japan, right?
Yes.
And then it took time to bring him back.
So he was incarcerated for 8 years, if I'm not mistaken.
Where was he?
He was incarcerated in Guam first, and in 1945 transferred to Japan, and spent the 8 years in prison there. And after 8 years, he got out and resumed his business activity from Japan, and he was not allowed to re-enter until 1961.
So, you know, when you mentioned that your grandfather was the head of the Japanese Chamber of Commerce, people kind of don't really understand, like, and even Frank's grandfather, all these Japanese men started lots of different kinds of businesses, and they were like almost, you know, a good percentage of the stores before the war were owned by Japanese, and you know, they figured like names like Shinohara and Ishizaki and Dejima and Sawada, and there were just a lot of these stores around, and that actually had a kind of impact on the way we live. In addition to Daigo and Rakyo.
So my understanding is my grandfather was an importer, he was an exporter.
Yeah.
He ran a restaurant, he ran a bar. They did soap manufacturing, they did a bunch of things.
Right.
So, when he got out of prison in Japan, he resumed his businesses from Japan and was able to still support my grandmother and my father and his sister here.
So with you, Frank, now what about your father? And what happened to your father during World War II?
My father had a rough World War II, but I got to back up before that. So my grandfather was part of the Japan Club. So it's the first Japan Club. And later on, my father became part of the Issei Association. And then we created the Nikkei Association. So this is the third generation of Nikkei-ness. So as far as my father lived a very comfortable life. My father was probably a very spoiled son, and he had everything because my grandfather had a very good bunch of businesses in Sumai. So he was always stealing from the register, taking stuff from the store for his friends. Right? And then my grandfather also had a taxi business. He had taxi, bar, grocery store, and pool hall, and a bunch of stuff like that. Okay.
Your father, what happened to your father?
So my father was protected by his mother. So my grandmother protected my dad from the controls of his father. But my grandmother died in 1939. And then my grandfather immediately decided, you, boy, you're gonna grow up in Japan. So he shipped him to Japan. And 1939 in Japan was a bad time to be going to Japan. So he got conscripted into the Imperial Army. And then he served in Manchuria. And then towards the end of World War II, they shipped him and his regiment to the Philippines. And so he just was wounded during the combat invasion of the Philippines. And he quickly decided, I'm not gonna do the Bataan March. And he surrendered. And because he spoke English, he was quickly, went through a bunch of interrogations with intelligence, and he did not serve time like Gil's grandfather, but what happened to my dad was after that he was shipped to Japan, and in Japan he ended up working for the MacArthur government, kind of a switchback, and then he met my mother, and then eventually he came home. So my dad was gone for 10 years. So he finally came back in 1949. And after that, he never wanted to leave Guam again, because this is where he grew up, this is his home. And it took him almost 2 years to petition the Navy for my mother and myself to be allowed entry into Guam. Because Guam was a naval secure island, quite different from today. So you need permission from the Navy, and there's clearances you got to get from the Navy, permission to enter Guam. People could not just come to Guam. And that's probably when your grandfather came back, and they allowed him to come back because the restrictions of entry into Guam.
Yes.
But you know, you guys had a lot of court battles. That was very yeah. I think just like the others, there were many others who were deported, but they didn't fight, they didn't struggle, they just gave up. So I know that a lot of them were just sent, and they never saw their fathers or, or their grandfathers again, even though they were alive. Yeah.
I know that my dad worked tirelessly to bring his father back to Guam. It was the Secretary of the Navy he had to deal with in order to get the attention that was necessary to address the issues that were brought upon my grandfather during his trial and stuff. And I think one thing of most significance is that my grandfather was charged with treason against the United States. And one of the findings during the appeal process was that my grandfather was a Japanese national. Thus, he could not be charged with treason.
But because of your grandfather's prominence, he also became kind of a lightning rod. Everybody who had a story all went back to Shinohara.
Yeah.
So I know that was part of that. Yeah. I'm also, because just in full disclosure, Gil and I are related through the Tauruses. So it was, I became quite familiar with that story, especially from my father, who talked about it a lot. So what does it mean to be to have this Japanese ancestry in your life today? What does that family story? How did that enter into your lives, and how do you explain it to others? If not that it needs explanation, but how has it played a role in your life?
It's a great question. It's I think I don't know for Gil, but I think it forced us to work harder.
Yeah.
Because growing up, I share a story. Growing up, the typical American boy would be playing cowboys and Indians.
Not here.
Here we played war. It was American soldier against Japanese soldier. And I didn't want to be the Japanese soldier because this is Guam. I grew up here. I speak better Chamorro than Japanese. But then every time we'd get it, so wait, I want to play that game, that role this time. And they said, no, you cannot because you're Japanese. So that was the only sense of discrimination I ever had. The rest of growing up in Guam was I was just part of the community.
Yeah.
I never felt discriminated. Some people may have. I never felt that.
Yeah.
Maybe I wasn't paying attention to that. but growing up here was good. But my father, as I got closer to finishing high school, there wasn't a lot of guidance my father gave me. But the one thing he said, boy, you're gonna have to study harder. You have to work harder because look at who you are.
Yeah.
And so that gave me a focus to make sure that I worked a little harder. But growing up here, I really didn't, because, growing up, going to school was not hard for me. But I kept that in mind. So that toughened me up, I guess. But I never really had to do that. So it helped me with all of my career development as I matured and finished college and finished grad school and pursued other things in government.
What about your family legacy, which you're very proud of because you have lots of pictures and mementos of that,
Yeah, so the Shinohara family had a colorful life, as you know. I mean, I don't know how to better describe it other than colorful. There were many, many challenges. My grandfather actually grew up on the island of Guam. He came here at the age of 18 and started his businesses and stuff. So I'm pretty sure he ran into many, many challenges being a foreigner, and he became successful and became a leader in the community. And that leadership in the community brought upon him all the problems after the war because of where he was in his life. And our lives today haven't been without challenges. There are people that still talk about the war. Not as many, but there are still people out there. Oh, yeah, you're the grandson of so and so, and things of that nature. And it's something we just got to let go of. One thing I can say is that the legacy of my grandfather continues. He was a businessman. My family is in business, still in business here on Guam, and we are going to continue to thrive. Guam is our home. Japanese blood runs in our veins. We are proud Japanese Chamorros.
That's good. That's great. And yet, you know, it's pretty obvious in your own experiences as you described them growing up. You know, it's always been a wonder to me that, you know, some families did not share the same pride and they ran away from it. They changed their names. They had Japanese names and they changed their name to Blas or Santos or other names. And, you know, there was always a little bit of that, you know, element of it, you know, like trying to figure out. But in growing up, obviously, you were just, you know, local guys, right? I mean, no, you know, manchamore todo and that whole kind of camaraderie that all of us felt.
Sure.
I mean, our connection to each other is through Chamorro, you know, and then we have historical experiences.
Well, you know, I want to add that in reading up on the history of my grandfather, one of the things he did was he wrote to the Secretary of the Navy, and he had said that much of the testimony that was offered by the local Japanese at that point is understood by him as a way to protect their family and their livelihood here on Guam because it was threatened.
Yeah.
Many of the people that testified against my grandfather did so out of fear for their family and themselves. So it's something he said he understood and he respected the people and he had no animosity with anybody who testified against him because it was a fight for survival at that period. At that time.
And there was a lot of encouragement given to people to come out and say things, you know, especially after the occupation. And so some of the stories got a little bit, you know, the one story I'll just share with was my father said they accused old man Shinohara of wiping the bar. He had a bar, of wiping the bar with an American flag. That's how he wiped it. And my father would say, well, that's just ridiculous. You know, that's just, you know, timagahit, you know, it's just bullshit. But people had that kind of, you know, so in a way, your grandfather became a lightning rod for all those things. But you know, the irony was, of course, as research has shown out in your own grandfather's experience, is there was all this effort to try to put him on trial for treason, and of course he wasn't an American citizen. How can you put somebody on trial for treason when he was a Japanese national? Yeah.
So during his trial, I think this is important. He was accused of slapping the governor of Guam, who was Macmillan at the time, on five different occasions. And during the appeals, he was able to get a letter from Governor Macmillan that said that never happened.
Yeah. So they had that story, and they had him also kicking Macmillan in the butt as they were walking up. They had a little camp where government house is now, and it's just so funny because one of the last acts of Macmillan before the war broke out was they had a Guam Militia Carnival. They had this annually. And you know who the queen of the Guam Militia Carnival was? Was Rosario Sayama. So there was a product of the Japanese Guam community was the queen. But of course, Macmillan, you know, himself just you know, as you said, it was a lot of exaggeration attached to that. So how old were you when your father passed away?
Oh, let me see. I was already in the FBI, so
Yeah.
he passed away in 1980.
I see. Yeah.
So my dad would have been, what, 60, 61, going on 62.
And so he had a brother who was here as well?
Yeah, my Uncle Ben was the baby,
Uh-huh.
and he joined the Army, and he moved to Sacramento, so, and he would always come and visit.
I see.
So my Uncle Ben passed away maybe 4 years ago.
Yeah. So your Uncle Ben was in the U.S. Army?
He was in the U.S. Army, and my father was in the Imperial Army.
Yeah. And how, you know, it's a kind of a poignant story, you know. But on the other hand, there's absolutely, obviously, no tone about anything about that in your life that is anything other than inspirational. You know, is that a fair statement?
For me, yes.
Yeah.
Well, absolutely. I want to share a story though, because
Sure.
my father, you know, he was gone for 10 years, and with the war and the American reinvasion and getting Guam restabled, his siblings, he had a bunch of sisters, they all thought, oh, he was dead. He was dead. But during the reconstruction of Guam, you know, a lot of Filipino contract workers came over here as part of Masdelco, and in fact, they had a camp down in Sumay called Camp Rojas. But anyway, so one of the Filipino workers said, you know, I met this Japanese soldier, and he said he was from Guam. And he started sharing what he remembered, and that got around, and my father's siblings said, oh, he's alive. So they had assumed he had died from the war.
Yeah.
And it took him a little longer to actually make it back home.
Yeah.
So it was great for him, and he ended up working for the Navy actually afterwards.
So what do you think, you know, other than just memories of, he brought back a Japanese wife. Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, I mean, that took a lot. That took a level of commitment. He was in the Japanese Army, he's already out, he's working for the MacArthur government, he'd already, you know, established a family, but he kept that drive to come back to Guam.
Yeah, this is home. This is home. So he was just happy to make it home. And he never wanted to leave Guam again. and working for the Navy, I remember a few times growing up that he was supposed to go somewhere else to work or go for training, and he kept turning him down. He didn't want to leave Guam, because the last time he left Guam, he was gone for 10 years and there was a war. So anyway, so growing up in Guam was just great for us, and I'm proud to be part Chamorro. So I'm only 4分の1, 1/4 Chamorro.
Yeah.
And the rest of it is Japanese,
All right.
because my mother's all Japanese and my dad was half Japanese. So.
Yeah.
And I'm the reverse of him.
That's right. Yeah. Well, I'm more like you. I'm only 1/4 American. So it's a kind of interesting how all of these lives intertwine. And of course, you know, just grateful for you sharing these stories with us, and grateful for your time today. So what's going on with the Shinohara family name in Guam today?
Well, my mother and father had 10 children. I'm number 4 of 10. 4 live away from Guam. 6 remain here. We're all in business, and we're doing tremendous. I myself have 9 kids, and I have 19 grandchildren. So the Shinohara name is going to prevail for a long time.
I see. Very good. How about the Ishizaki?
Well, Ishizaki was always a small family,
Uh-huh.
and my parents decided after one child that was enough. So I was an only child, I guess, maybe spoiled, maybe not so spoiled, because growing up after the war, there was not a lot of stuff to get spoiled about or with. So education was good for me. You know, I've worked primarily in government, So I was a police officer and then became an FBI agent. And then towards the end of my career in the FBI, I came back to Guam and ran the FBI operations out here. And then it was time to retire. And then I dabbled in different things, talk radio, and then I became Director of Corrections for Governor Felix Camacho, and then Chief of Police for Felix, and then I became Homeland Security Advisor. And then Dr. Underwood, as President of the University of Guam, invited me to become part of the faculty for the University of Guam, so I continue to teach at the University of Guam. As far as children, I've got a couple of kids, I've got one grandchild, and then a bunch of stepchildren and step-grandchildren. So we're not as large a family as the Shinoharas, but my kids and grandkids are primarily in the United States, and they like living in California.
So do your children have a sense of this original Japanese immigration to Guam, or is that just kind of interesting family story? How often do you talk about it in terms of like your own children and grandchildren?
So it's often a topic of conversation in my home because my kids have children of their own that are asking questions.
Yeah.
And as a result of that, the story comes out.
Yeah.
We've talked about it. I have grandchildren as young as 7 years old saying, they told me I have to do a paper and we have to do a family tree and things like that. And the question always comes out, how did we come to Guam? How is it that we're Shinohara and we're Chamorros, but it's a Japanese name? So it's constant educating with the kids that are growing up today that are being told to look into the family tree, and the questions arise.
Right.
Well, my son was born here. He went to school until maybe the 6th grade here. And then when I became an FBI agent, he moved with me to Hawaii. So he went to public school in Hawaii, and then I got transferred to Los Angeles, and he moved with me to Los Angeles, and he set his roots in LA. And in Los Angeles, he got into the TV broadcasting industry. And he does all kinds of things in that industry. And one of them is he's been trying to push the script about the Ishizaki story. So he's written some things, and he's trying to push them through Hollywood with all these production companies, and I wish him success. So that's my story about the next generation.
So does your son want to tell your story or your grandfather's story or your father's story?
He's actually trying to move a story about him and me.
Yeah.
And then I keep telling him to share the grandfather story, because the grandfather story is a lot more
Well, that's
interesting.
very powerful.
Yeah.
Very powerful.
Yeah.
Very powerful.
Can I ask one question?
Sure.
Interesting to hear that most of the father, grandfather, member of Japan Club, they said then chamber or something.
Yeah.
Do you have any picture of friend at the time, member of Japan Club?
So there is a picture floating around. I believe Frank Shimizu and Paul Shimizu have it. It's pictures that have been published, but there was a picture of the founding members of the Japan Chamber of Commerce on Guam. And it was a picture taken beachside, somewhere here in Tumuning.
So Frank Shimizu may have that.
Frank may have it, yes.
At that time, Japan government help or support Japan Club of Guam. You never heard that.
Back pre-war.
Yeah, but yes.
So I understand that there was a relationship between Japan and Guam at that particular time. So they were getting some kind of support. I don't know if it was monetary. I can't speak to that.
I see.
But there was a relationship between the Japanese government, the Guam government, and the business people here.
I see. After war, U.S. government took over here. Is there any problem? Problem meaning any, how do you say, difficulty? You said something, prisoner, I'm not sure.
Oh, for the Shinohara family,
He was in prison. Yeah.
big
Yeah.
difficulty. Yes.
Because of Japanese, working for Japan Club, or what is?
So it was not that he was working with it. Number one, he was one of the leaders in the Japanese community. So when the Japanese took over Guam, he was tapped to be an interpreter, and he actually played a major role, Takagi-san, in that he was the individual that was identified with the Japanese to go out and scout the Chamorros and identify who the business people were and who the critical people were for the Japanese to be dealing with. So he had a very strong role. And not so much because of popularity, but because of where he was in the community at that time. So he was one of the more prominent businessmen at that particular time. And my grandfather spoke Japanese, English, and Chamorro. So he was fluent in all three languages.
So he and Mr. Shinohara also, due to his prominence, he also tried to organize, community events or entertainment, things like that.
Sure.
So that, my father had the ability to play the saw. My father played the saw. He learned this when he was in the South,
Oh, yeah.
So he knew how to play the saw. So his uncle, which would be Mr. Shin, recruited him to play the saw for Japanese events. So he had that level. So, well, so his grandfather was put on trial. That's for those. I don't know that very many others were put on trial. But obviously the interpreters from Saipan were put on trial.
So I think there was like 5 Japanese names that were put on trial. 5 individuals with Japanese names, and of course, my grandfather suffered the most as a result of that.
Also, Gil, your grandfather said came from ship. He just
So he was put on a boat in Japan and told by his parents to go to the United States and go to school. He was age 18. But when the boat stopped here for refueling, he loved the greenery and he said, "I'm staying," and his brother went on.
interesting.
Yeah. So at age 18, he started business here in Guam. So
Actually, your grandfather came by himself.
Yes.
No someone to bring.
No.
I see. What about Frank's grandfather? He came from Frank Shimizu's same. A lot of friend then. A lot of friend meaning you can see the picture of what you call it. The Frank Shimizu has a trading company.
Yeah.
So your grandfather part of that.
I think my grandfather was part of that. He came from Ibaraki Ken. I don't know where in Ibaraki Ken. I think that Frank Shimizu had done a lot of research, and hopefully they'll figure out where they all came from.
Okay.
So anyway, he came here, and I don't know what he did for the company, but eventually ventured off on his own.
Also, your grandfather lived in Sumai, right?
Yes.
Sumai is what you call it. Monte's father lived in Sumai too. Monte.
Mesa.
Yeah?
Monte Mesa.
Monte Mesa, yeah.
Yes.
Yoda family.
Yeah.
Yeah, Noda family.
Noda family.
Yes.
They very close to each other.
I think Monty's brother did some research and he found that his grandfather Noda and my grandfather might have traveled together on a ship at one time, because the ships were going back and forth between Japan and the Saipan and Guam. Yeah, and it was really part of the copra industry.
Yeah.
So they collected copra, shipped the copra to Japan, sold the copra in Japan, and then they bought other commodities that were needed here. So, and I think the Shimizus had maybe 2 ships. So the one ship was going north and the other coming south, and so it was a very lucrative trading business.
Just out of curiosity, do you guys still have any kind of connection or relatives that you reach out to or are still in communication with in Japan?
Yeah, I do. I had one connection with my father's cousin, but I lost touch with him. I still communicate with my mother's side. So my mother's, I think we're down to 2 siblings that my mother's, 2 sisters are still alive. So they all kind of came from Hokkaido and I'm not sure all the history because I didn't spend enough time asking those questions. As far as my mother's older brother, he got kidnapped by the Navy as part because he was a PhD physicist, and so he went to Tokyo Daigaku. So and then he was finishing during the war. So he was, and the U.S. government was very good at identifying scientists from Germany and Italy and Japan, and so my uncle Koichi was one of those. So he got recruited by the Navy, probably involuntarily, but I think it was good for him.
But what year would that be? That one?
Well, I'm sure it was 1945.
Yeah, it was right after the
Yeah,
war.
and so he ended up going for doing naval research, and finally finished up at MIT. He became a professor emeritus for MIT, and he died maybe 5 years ago, and I couldn't make it to his ceremony. So he actually trained a lot of naval officers in how to build ships. So that was my mother's side. So as far as linkage, I still have a little bit, but not as much as I'd like to. And with the COVID travel restrictions, it's impossible to go to Japan.
So on my side, there's very limited contact with our relatives. Most have moved to the United States. Some are in Canada, and we communicate once a year via Christmas card and stuff. But it's rare that we make contact with them. As a matter of fact, the last time I saw anybody face to face was probably 1997. You know, when a cousin of mine visited here on Guam. So it's been a while.
So you know that your family, your father was born.
Do I know where my father was born?
Yeah.
Grandfather.
My father was born on Guam. My grandfather was born in Kagoshima.
Kagoshima.
1887.
1887?
1887.
1888.
And he came to Guam in 1905. So he was 18 years old.
Okay.
I guess going in on those thoughts about Japan, but have you guys had a chance to visit Japan? Obviously with COVID that changed a little bit, but what are your current thoughts about modern day Japan and culture, kind of as it relates to you now? But, thoughts?
Well, Japan is a hustling and bustling place. It's at a really fast pace today. I have problems walking through the subway and the train stations and stuff because I'm a big person. And everybody is rushing and pushing, and if I push, they fly, right? So there was an actual true story. I was with a friend of my father's, and he was running through the crowd to catch the train, and I got left behind because I couldn't push anybody without them falling. And they had to call the police from the other station to come and get me, just to join up with the individual that was taking care of me at the time. So we've been to Japan many a time. Today, it's for vacationing with grandkids and enjoying the sights. So it's indoctrinating my kids and my grandkids about the Japanese side of the family.
Well, I really enjoy going to Japan, but Japan is a very foreign country for me. If I look, because I grew up here. I lived a lot in the mainland United States, but I also, for working for the FBI, I did a lot of foreign travel for the U.S. government, and so going to Japan is kind of like going to one of those countries, and I love going to. The best part of Japan for me is the scenery, the culture, and the food. I love the food.
I completely agree. Okay, so I guess maybe some closing thoughts. This is your opportunity to maybe share a little bit of wisdom, share your thoughts to Guam's viewers and the youth. Can you guys share some words of wisdom?
Well, we have, I feel really blessed to have grown up here. We went through some difficult times in our family history, and I'm part of Guam, more than any other place in the world. And so I'm proud to be the 1/4 Chamorro, and I'm also proud to be the 3/4 Japanese. And Guam is very forgiving. I think Guam is very forgiving, knowing that the brutality of war was here. And I feel very fortunate that no one's kept me, treated me in a bad way for those atrocities. And I'm sorry for all of that. Our family suffered as well. But there is that guilt that I have of being part Japanese, and even though I have nothing to do with the war, that we still carry that burden, and I don't think there's anything we can do beyond just living our age and growing our kids and teaching our history and our culture. So, and I thank Guam. Guam has been very good for our family.
So while the Japanese side of the family originates from Kagoshima, we are Chamorros, and we live as Chamorros. We don't dispel the fact that we have Japanese blood. As a matter of fact, I'm quite proud of the Shinohara name. I understand my family history and the challenges that my grandfather and his children went through along with my grandmother, and it was substantial. Yet business continued to thrive for the Shinohara family, and we are strongly rooted here, and we are a permanent family here on this island, and proud to be Chamorro and proud to be Japanese.
Thank you. Just Marcy.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much for including us.
Japan Cultural Exploration in Guam.